Okay, now we're going to open it up for questions and answers, hopefully. As we said before, there's two alternatives. The first is to come to this microphone, and I encourage you to please do that if you are comfortable doing that. So I just ask that you would now make your way to the microphone here. The other alternative is to take note cards that hopefully you have been given, and Kelly can give you some more if you raise your hand if you want one. Write a question down there and then pass it into the aisle, and we'll come by and pick it up and then pass it on. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Hi. My question is, isn't it rather unrealistic and perhaps self-centered for God to condemn a bunch of atheists who don't believe in him when he hasn't given them any convincing reason to believe in him?
Right. The question, please stay there so I repeat it rightly. Isn't it rather self-centered of God to condemn a group of atheists who he has not given sufficient reason for them to believe in him? Right? Is that the gist of what you're saying? Okay. Fine. Why don't you sit down and I'll take a few moments to answer this here. I remember once when I was writing a questionnaire with philosophical questions, the first question was, God is perfect, explain. And I turned to my wife and said, the only more difficult thing I can think of is to say, define God and give 2 examples. Your question, sir, is a very valid one, but let me first tell you some of the assumptions of your question, which you will first have to defend before the question is even valid. And that is vitally important for you to bear that in mind. You have invoked a moral law in raising the question. You have invoked a moral law in raising the question. And that moral law basically says it would be immoral of God to do this without giving sufficient evidence to condemn somebody. Is that not the presupposition of your question? It has to be, or the question self-destructs. The point that you have raised is, I'll never forget when I was doing a lectureship, and by the way, it's a thorny question and it's an important one. I don't want to minimize it, but I want you to know the more I look at a question such as that myself, it has more of an existential rub than a philosophical and a logical rub. I'll tell you why. When I was doing a series of lectures at the University of Nottingham some years ago, it came in a different form, the form of evil and the problem of suffering and so on. And their student basically enjoined the fact that there was too much evil in this world, therefore he could not accept that there was a God because of the presence of evil. But when you say there's such a thing as evil, you admit there's such a thing as evil, as I said to him, let me interact with you, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? And he paused for a moment, just as you did, and said, yeah, it seems to me, yeah, that it is so. And so I said, do you admit that there's such a thing as good? He posited evil and then ultimately admitted that there was such a thing as good. I said, but when you say there's such a thing as a good, aren't you positing such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between evil and good? Bertrand Russell, when he debated the Jesuit priest, Father Copleston, the priest said to him, Mr. Russell, how do you differentiate between right and wrong? Bertrand Russell said, the same way I differentiate between yellow and green. And that was right out of Moore's Ethica and so on. So Copleston said to him, but wait a minute, you differentiate between yellow and green or blue and green by seeing, don't you? He said, yes. He said, how do you differentiate between good and bad? Bertrand Russell said, on the basis of feeling. What else? Now, Copleston was a kind man. Somebody like Kant or anyone else could have just turned to him and said, excuse me, Mr. Russell, but in some cultures they love their neighbors, in other cultures they eat them, both on the basis of feeling. Do you have a personal preference? You see, so when you talk about a moral law, you've got to talk about a moral lawgiver. I said, but that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's really no moral lawgiver, there is no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no such thing as essential good. If there's no such thing as essential good, there's no such thing as essential evil. I said, what is your question? And his comment to me was, what then am I asking you? I knew what he was asking me, but you need to be sure that you have invoked a moral law, and your question is only valid if a moral law is present in this universe. If a moral law is not present, then the question is no longer as thorny as you've stated it. Now, the answer therefore lies in the fact that it must be given with God in the paradigm, and so you are raising the issue now in that form, saying, all right, this God exists, let us assume that for a moment. If this God exists, what sort of a God is he anyway, by not giving sufficient evidence to atheists? And you've taken those words actually right out of Bertrand Russell's mouth, because Bertrand Russell is the one who was asked, what will you say to God if you stand before him? Bertrand Russell said, I will just say to him, you have not given me sufficient reason to believe in you. That's what I will say to him. Now, what is interesting about this whole process is that there are two things at play in the question. One is the reality of a moral God and the reality of an autonomous human being. Love is the principal facet of God's creation. In the Christian world only, not in any other worldview, does love precede life. In the Joseph Fletcherian situation ethics, it is a kind of life preceding love. Now you love and use that as the central point of all ethics. Now, if God has created us in love, for the purpose of love, then in the image of God concept, according to the classical theologians, one of the aspects of the image is self-determination. Now, would it not be more immoral for God in that scene to violate the freedom of will of anybody and compel a response to him apart from anything else? Because what qualifies as legitimate evidence for A may not qualify as legitimate evidence for B. And the psalmist says, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows his handiwork. When you take the cosmological basis for God's existence, and I'll be giving you some of the evidences tomorrow in the person of Christ, when you take the historical basis of Christ, of the evidence that Christ gives to us, when you even go into the ontological or the teleological and all of their classical formulations of the argument, and the very cross that reaches out, Simon Greenleaf, who taught in this area several years ago, Simon Greenleaf said, a person who rejects Christ may choose to say that I do not accept it. He may not choose to say there is not enough evidence. And the cumulative evidence is utterly overwhelming, both from a cosmological and an existential factor. And may I also say this, that nobody ultimately ends up in an eternity apart from God, apart from their own choice in that. In other words, even heaven would be hell for somebody who wanted to be autonomous. And in this world, they have made their choice to choose the next world also to be apart from God. So you go back to the moral underpinning of your question, which assumes a moral law, which you cannot assume unless there's a moral lawgiver. So the question is resolved, not solved in the senses which you have presented it. It is resolved with God within the framework.